we now want to see how we can animate our bird to not just have this static image, but instead a good looking animation when the bird is actually flying. We do have a dedicated video on this topic where we go over the basic mechanisms of animating sprite nodes. Therefore, I won't get in too much detail about the corresponding methods in this video. So if you feel uncertain or you have any questions about what we are doing here, please make sure that you watch the animation video, which will probably clear things up a little. However, we will create everything here from scratch, so if you're feeling confident, you will be able to follow along easily. The first thing we want to do is create a helper file that will aid us in loading the appropriate textures for our animation. I will create a new group in my birds project, and I will call it helper files. I can then create a new file in this group, which will be a Swift file called animation helper. In this new file, I will begin by importing SpriteKit, and I will then create a new class with the name animation helper. This class will, for now, only get one type method that we can then use for the class itself, or with the class itself. So I'll write static func and call this method load textures. It will get a parameter from Atlas of type skTextureAtlas and another parameter with name of type string. We also want to return an array of skTextures here, so let's specify this as a return value. What we're trying to do here is load all the individual textures from a sprite atlas and then return them in an array, which we can then use to animate our sprites. Since we do have to return a texture array, I will begin by defining it as a variable called textures initialized as an empty skTexture array. Right at the bottom of my method, I can then write return textures so that our error disappears, since we are now actually returning a valid value before we return our array, though we want to actually load the textures from the past atlas and append them to the array. To do so, we're going to use a for loop by writing for index in 0 up to less than atlas.texturenames.count, which will give us the exact number of textures contained in this atlas. Inside of this for loop, I now want to access every individual texture by first of all creating a constant called texture name, which will be set to name plus the string of our counter variable index. Actually, I have to add 1 to my index here. Now, what does this do? I'm just using my parameter name, which gets passed to the method and append a number to it. So if I, for example, pass blue to this method, it gives me the texture names blue 1 through 4, which are all texture names that I need for this particular bird. I can then add the corresponding textures to my array by writing textures.append. And then I will just add atlas.textureNamed and texture name to this array, which just adds the texture with this name from my atlas to the array, so that after the for loop, I have populated texture array, which I then return. The class that we're actually going to use this in is the bird class, since we now want to make sure that if we shoot our bird or if we launch our bird, it gets a proper flying animation. And to achieve this, I'll begin by adding a new property to my class. It's a constant called flying frames, and its type is an skTexture array. I will now, of course, need to provide a value for this constant in my initializer, and I can do so by writing flying frames and then using my animation helper class and its load textures method And I will now have to pass it an atlas and a name. Let's take another look at our asset catalog. More specifically, at our birds folder. It contains the folders blue, gray, red, and yellow for our different birds, which then contain all the needed textures. The folders containing the individual images do now of course have to be actual sprite atlases and not just ordinary folders as they currently still are. That's why in my birds folder here, I want to create 4 sprite atlases. Which I will then call red, blue, yellow, and gray. Then I can then go ahead and copy the appropriate images to their respective sprite atlases. So let's do it for red and for gray. I can also delete the old folders right after. And I can then do it for blue and finally for yellow. So that we have our images in actual sprite atlases we can retrieve them from. I've also made sure all the atlas names are lowercase. Back in my bird class, I can once again use the type that I can get here as the strings red, blue, yellow, and gray. So I can use this with type.rawValue for my texture atlas, as well as my name parameter. Now obviously, the texture atlas shouldn't be a string parameter, but instead a SK texture atlas initialized with the name type.rawValue. This will now properly initialize my flying frames property by passing it all the necessary textures from the corresponding atlas. Now, what do I want to do with it? Well, I want to use it to animate my bird sprites when they are flying. Therefore, I'm going to create a new method with the name animateFlight. And inside of this method, I want to run the appropriate animation action on the bird node itself. We should also add a parameter here. Let's call it active and make it of type bool, so that I can also use this method to remove the action when our bird isn't flying anymore. Inside, I'll begin by checking if active, and if we get true for this parameter, I'll directly call the runAction method and begin by creating an skAction.repeatForever. Since I want to run this animation for as long as our bird is flying. So for the actual animation, I will pass an skAction.animate. And I want to choose the method with texture, time, per frame, resize, and restore parameters. So let's choose this one. For the skTextureArray, I will of course pass my flying frames property for time per frame, which is the time each frame gets displayed. I will pass 0.1, and resize as well as restore will both be true. If we now call this animateFlight method with the argument true, our bird should run its animation. We will now add the else part, where all we want to do is remove this animation. I can do this quite easily by just writing remove all actions. Since the animation is the only action running with our bird, this won't affect any other aspects of the game. But where should we call this animateFlight method? It's actually pretty simple. We'll do it in the did_setObserver of our flying property. So if flying is set to true, I will just add the call to animateFlight with the argument true. If this isn't the case, meaning flying is set to false, we can, in the else part that we are now going to add, call animateFlight with the argument false. we have already implemented that. As soon as our bird hits the ground, its flying property gets set to false, meaning if we now launch our bird, it should be animated, and as soon as it hits the ground or the edge, the animation should stop. So let's run the app on a device to make sure we have a smooth frame rate and we can see how it looks. Alright, I will once again launch my bird, and we can now see that as soon as I let go, the flying animation runs on the bird. As soon as it hits the ground, our physics delegate makes sure that the animation stops, which is pretty good. But let's try it again with the bluebird and make it fly onto the stones here, where I can now see the animation continue, since our bird did not hit the ground, which isn't really that optimal. We should probably also set the flying property to false if we hit a block with our bird. So why don't you try to implement this for the next video, where I will quickly implement it and we can then continue.